firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we are meeting today. So I am on the Wulguru, Kaba and Bindal people's land here in Townsville, where I live. And I acknowledge all of the lands on which we are meeting, the people who are on this call or meeting today. I also pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Today I'm going to be giving a talk on a concept called rewilding. Now, rewilding, you don't hear as much about it here in Australia as you do in Europe, and I'll show some examples from Europe of rewilding. But I am going to argue a couple of things, one of which is that many of the systems that people are trying to rewild are in effect have to have some form of human intervention in order to be able to most effectively deliver the kinds of services that we're expecting those rewilded landscapes to produce. And secondly, I'll argue that livestock can play, domestic livestock, that's basically our ruminants and non-ruminant herbivores, can play a role in delivering those landscapes which provide, as I said, those cultural, environmental and economic services to the people who want to enjoy them. Now, when we think about wilderness or wild landscapes, we think about areas like the big plains of Africa with their herds of wild animals, zebras and wildebeest, in this case in the Serengeti, the big tundra regions of northern Europe and northern Asia, the outback and desert regions of the world, including those in Australia. And these are historically seen as being places where humans have limited or no intervention. And the challenge is that we only have about 25% of the wilderness areas left that we had before the start of the Industrial Revolution. So there's been a movement to try and both protect wilderness areas and also to restore areas back to their wilderness state, which is called rewilding. One of the issues that I have in relation to the ways in which wilderness is described is that, in effect, I think wilderness can be seen as a colonial concept because it formed part of what is called fortress conservation. So basically, the first national park that was declared was Yosemite in the USA, and the Honorary people, which were the tribal Indian communities that lived in Yosemite, were cleared out of that national park in 1851. The park was declared in 1864 by Abraham Lincoln and John Muir, a famous Scottish naturalist and an advocate for the park movement, stated that Yosemite was pure wilderness with no make of man visible upon it. So in effect saying that humans had not had any kind of ways in which they had impacted on those landscapes. But many of the wilderness areas around the world actually have indigenous and traditional communities living or have lived in those areas. And many of those landscapes are shaped by that relationship between people and those landscapes. So I don't see wilderness areas as necessarily having no human intervention, but are places where humans have shaped those landscapes in the past. So these are wilderness areas. I said about 25% of them are left. So we've lost about 75% of those areas. And over the last 2 decades, we've lost about 3 million square kilometers of wilderness areas. Many of those have been lost through degradation. So deforestation, for example, where at the moment we're losing about 1% of our forest landscapes every year, and only about 50% of the original forested landscapes are left on the planet. If you look at soil erosion, about 4.3 to the power 10 tons of soil gets eroded out into the sea every year. And we have about 275 million tons of plastic waste produced every year, of which about 8 million tons goes into the sea. All of these degrade those pristine ecosystems and lead to loss of biodiversity. So here we have what's called the Living Planet Index, which comes from the World Wildlife Fund. So the last one that was produced was in 2020, and that has a list up until 2016. So the Living Planet Index is the average of over 20,000 populations representing over 4,000 species. And in the period between 1970, which is classed as a value of an index of 1, we've lost about 68% of those of the Living Planet Index, which is an effective composite of losing species and also losing populations of those species. So, I mean, these are really challenging statistics that we're hearing around the ways in which biodiversity is being lost and ecosystems are being degraded. And this isn't something that's happened just recently. Megaformal extinctions have happened in the past. So here's an example of the megaformal extinctions that have happened in Australia. So we see a peak of extinctions about happening just over 40,000 years ago. So many of the species in the diagram on the left-hand side here have now been lost, including large wombats, large kangaroos, a range of different species of large emu, for example, and large reptiles. So, so it's not something that is just happened in the recent times. It's also happened in the past, particularly when humans have come on the continents. This is a recently published paper looking at the loss of large herbivores across continents. So I am colorblind. So for those of you who are able to do hyperspectral vision, you'll get a lot better idea than I have here. But the top line is the one which shows the large herbivore biomass for Africa across the difference of net primary productivity. So that's an indication of the amount of vegetation that is produced. So as net primary productivity increases, the large herbivore biomass in Africa increases. The other populations that we see in terms of those that are for example, global, or those in North America, are significantly lower biomass for a given amount of net primary productivity. And the suggestion here is that means that the African system, which is seen as being the most complete of the large herbivores systems in the world, is demonstrating that those other systems to a certain extent in Europe, globally, North America and South America, are much lower in their densities of animals than would be expected to occur. And that's a lot of it because of past megaformal extinctions. And so those megafaunal extinctions, again, this is a recently published paper, which is showing the fact that when the extinctions happen in certain continents like North America and South America, there has been an increase in the fire activity across those continents. So the fire activity is relatively low on the left-hand side, and then increases when the extinctions happen. And this is because of the buildup in biomass, vegetation biomass that there is, and that vegetation biomass then burns off, and that can change the aspects of landscapes quite significantly. So that's the background to what I'm going to be talking about today. But what I'm keen to have a conversation about is the idea of different types of rewilding, or the different types of rewilding that happen. So there's a range of different theoretical approaches towards the idea of rewilding. So rewilding generally is restoring big wilderness based on the regulation of large herbivores. That was the original concept. Large predators, sorry, that was the original concept. There's a range of different other types, including Pleistocene rewilding, which is bringing back the ecological interactions that were happening about 13,000 years ago, before these big megaformal extinctions that happened. Passive rewilding, that's generally about land, land that's being abandoned, particularly in Europe, where there is very little intervention. It's just seeing what happens. And then you've got translocation rewilding, which I'll talk about later on at Australis Plus and in the Netherlands. I think that if we think about rewilding within the context of the broader relationship between humanity and ecosystems, you have highly intensive and modified systems on the left-hand side here, urban, intensive use and agricultural. You then have, moving on to semi-natural, which is areas which have a relatively low level of human intervention, and then wilderness areas, which is where humans have a light touch. In the ways in which I try and describe rewilding, is you have rewilding max that occurs when rewilding when areas have little human intervention, and then rewilding light, where you get some degree of human intervention in order to be able to ensure that you get the ecological outcomes that you're trying to achieve. So rewilding is becoming a very popular subject in the academic literature. Here we have a graph showing the publications per year on rewilding since it was originally conceived in 1998 up until 2020, I think it is. I've lost my 2019, and you see that publications were relatively low until about 2013. They've started to pick up now, so you're getting about 80 publications a year which mention rewilding now. And there are some in some parts of the world, for example, in Europe, there is a significant political and advocacy drive towards rewilding landscapes. So rewilding is seen as being a way in which you can bring back nature-based economies into areas that have been, particularly areas that are engaging in land abandonment at the moment. So many of those are in southern Europe. But you've also, for those of you who, because we're affiliated with the Royal Society of Biology, in the UK now, there's a lot of different small-scale rewilding projects that are happening, particularly through things like deer management, management of deer and management of landscapes through grazing by traditional breeds. And I'll talk about that more in a moment. But if we start off on a relatively easy idea to think about in relation to rewilding landscapes, this is in Northern Europe. So these are the traditionally herded reindeer. So they're semi-domestic reindeer herds. And the Rewilding Sweden has set up a set of projects in order to use rewilding concepts in the traditionally herded reindeer landscapes to bring economies back to these communities which are being lost for and also losing their traditional techniques of reindeer management. And so here the reindeer skin, antlers, tourism activity are now used as ways of generating economic activity within the idea of ensuring that the reindeer management is one which allows the landscapes to sustain and restore their vigor and complexity. If I come back to the megafaunal extinctions, though, this one was Australia. So many of the species, whilst in northern Sweden, you still have species like reindeer, which are which are large herbivores which have traditionally grazed these areas. In many regions of the world, you no longer have these species because they've become extinct. And in that case, if you're wishing to restore herbivory or predation, you need to see a way in which you can bring that back, which may be using things other than those species. There are things like called de-extinction. There's ideas about bringing back the woolly mammoths, for example, through using DNA techniques. But that's going to be a long way off from the kinds of time that is necessary for us to be bringing back herbivory into these systems. And so in some places, like this is the Coa Valley in Portugal, in recent years, there's been a significant abandonment of land, and this led to large wildfires, as I talked about before, that were risking tourism and infrastructure and lives. And so they've brought back grazing by large herbivores, so horses and cattle, particularly native breeds, local native and traditional breeds, to reduce the level, the amount of vegetation biomass. And in some cases, local communities are now able to gain money from the ecotourism adventures that are there to see these landscapes being grazed by these traditional breeds. In other cases, say, for example, in Southern Europe, there was a call for people to go back onto the land to graze these areas to reduce vegetation biomass. And many people who came were the good lifers from Paris, who came down and required quite significant interventions from extension officers from the agricultural service in order to be able to understand how to manage these animals that they had never had the experience of managing. So there's quite a number of different alternative approaches towards the ways in which you can reinstate grazing by traditional breeds into landscapes. But this one in the Coa Valley is an example where they're doing it specifically within the context of European rewilding. Another example is this, which is the Net Castle in the UK. It's about 80 miles from London, in which they've it's an estate of about 1,200 hectares, and in that estate they have removed the tradition, removed the modern breeds of animals, and they've replaced them with longhorn cattle, with Dartmoor ponies, with Tamworth pigs, and those animals now graze those landscapes in a way which has brought back significant amounts of biodiversity into the landscape. The people who own the particular piece of land here make about £1 million a year out of their selling the meat from these animals, and also from ecotourism adventures as well. And so they sell the ecotourism adventures on terms of this being a wild place close to the major conurbation city of London. One of the very first examples of rewilding that happened within the UK, within the European situation, was this a place called Oostvaardersplassen. So, and it's called the oldest large-scale rewilding area in Europe. It's about 6,000 hectares in size. In it, it is a reclaimed polder, so it's a reclaimed piece of the sea. And in it, there was this idea that in order to be able to get the landscapes that were historically in Europe, where you had a mixture of woodland and pastures, you needed to be able to create open landscapes for grazing by large herbivores. And again, the large herbivores that were there, the aurochs, the tarpow, the Przewalski's horses, and the wild animals that were there before have been exterminated by people. So the idea here is to bring back what is sets of traditional or reconstructed breeds that are supposed to look like those ancient species that have now gone extinct. So there were 32 heck cattle, 18 conic horses, and 40 red deer brought into this 6,000 hectare enclosure. And over time, about 6,000 animals are now were present in the landscape, which led to significant damage to the ecosystem, significant starvation and loss of animals. So this was highly controversial within the Netherlands and internationally. And there was a scientific group set up to look at this, and as recently as 2018, they've now started to cull animals out of this system to reduce the starvation and to allow the vegetation and the wood pasture to be restored. So even here, which was seen as being the sort of the archetypal rewilding project, where you had wild and traditional wild species and traditional breeds, you have to have some form of human intervention in order to be able to ensure that you don't lead to consequences which affect in effect the social license to operate for these rewilding projects. So yes, use domestic animals or traditional breeds for rewilding projects, but you still need to have human intervention, because predation is often not part of these systems, because of the fact that in Europe, at least, they're very close to human settlements, and those and people are not willing to have large predators operating close to their conurbations. So this is coming up to the end of the talk, and I'm looking forward to the questions at the end. So rewilding, in my view, is a new kid on the block. It's there's been a set of philosophical ideas about the purity of the idea of wilderness and rewilding. I think there's different approaches in different parts of the world. The US still tends to view it much more as areas where there are no human intervention and where there's what's called fortress conservation, whereas in Europe, which is much more heavily populated, there is the idea that domestic animals can play a part, and that human interventions are necessary. I think there's yet to be a real debate within Australia as to the extent to which rewilding occurs, if at all. I advocate here a pragmatic approach to rewilding, which I call rewilding light, which allows for herbivory processes to be reinstated, primarily using domestic animals in order to be able to do that. It creates great, in my view, that by using domestic animals, it allows you to create opportunities outside protected areas for biodiversity and conservation outcomes to be achieved, and it allows people to benefit from either the meat of the animals that are culled from these programs, or from ecotourism adventures. And so it allows people to benefit as well as nature. So that gives you a brief overview. This is a couple of papers which are produced this year on the topic, one in sustainability and the other one in frontiers for sustainable food systems. And I'm looking forward to your questions. And just as an end point, yes, so I forgot to introduce myself at the beginning. My name is Iain Gordon. I am an adjunct professor at ANU, University of Lincoln, and at Central Queensland University, and I have been working in biodiversity and conservation projects across all continents of the planet except for Antarctica, because most of my work is on large hairy mammals. So thank you very much indeed.